Hi there guys, I hope you're all well. So as you can see from the title of today's video, we're going to be talking about setting boundaries and communicating assertively. So you might be wondering, what does this have to do with self-esteem? And I think that's a very good question. So boundaries are sort of integral to having good self-esteem. By setting boundaries, we're helping to improve our self-esteem by teaching ourselves that we are worthy of being a priority and worthy of putting ourselves first. So by setting boundaries, we're helping to, like I said, improve that self-esteem, we're improving our relationships, and they're also really important to help us maintain good mental health and to maintain our relationships with people. So stick around, today we're going to talk about boundaries, what they are, how we can set them, and some tips at the end. Enjoy! So let's start by talking a bit about what boundaries actually are. So in relation to the physical world, a boundary would be something like a fence or a wall. So it's something that lines sort of the limit of an area. But the boundaries we're talking about are a little less obvious. So we're talking about emotional or psychological boundaries. And we can imagine these like little invisible bubbles that we set. But the same as the wall of a fence, they're there to mark the limits of an area. So we can think of boundaries as sort of guidelines or rules that we create to identify how we want people to behave towards us and how we will respond when those limits are crossed. So having boundaries, having healthy boundaries and maintaining those boundaries, more importantly, means that we know and understand what our limits are. And boundaries, we can set them for pretty much anything. So our emotions and feelings, our possessions, our time and energy, our personal space. Like I said, pretty much anything. Anything that we own that we want to limit how people behave towards. So for example, you might set a boundary that you only answer your work emails between 9 and 5. Or maybe at home you set a boundary that you want people to ask before they borrow your things. So it could be basically anything. So when we're looking to sort of create and define what our boundaries might be, there are two main things that we can take into consideration. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what are my rights? So we all have sort of fundamental rights, things that we have a right to feel and the right to have. So you might want to start by considering some of the following. So, you know, that you have the right to be treated with respect, you have the right to say no without feeling guilty, you have the right to be as important as other people. So things like that are things that you want to consider when we're creating these boundaries. So what are your fundamental rights as a person? The next thing you want to think about is, what is your body saying? So when we're thinking about creating boundaries, our bodies can give us clues as to what they might be. So yeah, we're looking out for physical clues that people are pushing our boundaries, and that's when we know that we want to put a boundary in place. So for example, maybe you're at work and someone's asking you to do something that's not part of your job. You'll notice that you start to feel uncomfortable, your heart might start to race, you start to feel all hot and bothered. So that is a good indicator that maybe a boundary needs to be put into place and that you need to communicate those boundaries with the people at work. So yeah, to recap, so two things to bear in mind: what are my rights and what is my body telling me? So now let's talk a bit about how we're going to communicate those boundaries and enforce them. And the top tip here is to communicate assertively. So what do we mean by being assertive? I think it's important to not get it confused with aggression. I think a lot of the time assertiveness has this negative connotation that it means that we're being angry and shouting and getting our point across. And that's really not the case. True assertiveness is when we are expressing our needs, but we're also taking into account the needs of the other person. So a win-win situation in my eyes, and this is what we should really strive for. So when we're communicating assertively, try to remember the 3 C's. So confident, you need to really believe in your ability to deliver this message. It needs to be clear, so the message you have is a clear message and easy to understand, and controlled, so you can deliver this information in a calm and controlled manner without being aggressive and without shouting. Yeah, and I think the best way to really be assertive when we're communicating with other people is to follow the magic formula for iMessages. No, I don't mean the iPhone kind. iMessages are a way of reframing your statement to ensure that you remain assertive and don't start to be accusing of other people. So there's 4 simple steps. So the first one, we start the statement saying I feel. So, you know, taking responsibility for our own feelings, you're saying how we feel. So I feel stressed, or I feel annoyed or frustrated. Next part is when you. So we're then stating the behaviour that we think is a problem. So I feel stressed when you move my things without telling me. Okay. Next we add on because. So that's when we're saying what it is about that behaviour we don't like. So from the beginning, I feel stressed when you move my things without telling me because I then can't find what I'm looking for. With me so far? Great. And then the last bit, we say, I would like it if, and then we offer sort of a compromise or a preferred alternative. So we're not just sort of leaving that with the other person, we're sort of saying what we would like instead. So back to our example, so I feel annoyed when you move my things without telling me because I then can't find them. So I would prefer it if you asked me and I can move them myself. So easy, those 4 simple steps. So we're communicating how we're feeling, we're not sort of pinning blame on anyone, and yeah, getting our point across in an assertive manner. So yeah, iMessages. My next tip is learn how to say no. And this can be quite a difficult one if you tend to be a bit of a people pleaser and tend to put other people before yourself. But sometimes it's really important to say no for your own sanity and your own mental health. So, you know, learning to say no is a really important skill when we're putting these boundaries in place. You know, it's important to remember that no on its own is a complete sentence. You don't need to sort of justify your actions or sort of think of an elaborate excuse. No, by itself, is a complete sentence, full stop at the end. Unfortunately, you know, we can't control how other people react, so just because we're putting a boundary in place does not mean that other people will respect it. And that might be when you feel like some consequences to that might need to be put in place, which we'll get onto in a minute. But it's important for you to know that in itself, you saying no and stating your boundary is more than enough. And other people can then choose how they respond and whether or not they respect that. So my final tip is to communicate your needs and also communicate any consequences that will happen if the person continues to disrespect your boundaries. So with assertive communication, it's important that they begin with our needs. So going back to those I messages, we're saying I feel this, rather than sort of basing it on how we want the other person to behave. So for example, instead of saying I need you to stop bombarding me with messages when I'm out, if I don't respond straight away, instead we can say something like I need some space and time to reply to your messages. So rather than saying what it is we don't like about that behaviour, and sort of accusing the other person of doing something, we're sort of saying what we need, making it about us and our feelings, because then can't be wrong, can we? Because our feelings are our feelings and they're valid. So yeah, make sure you're communicating your needs. It's also really important to state any consequences that will happen if the person continues to cross your boundaries. And more importantly than that is that if you put those consequences in place, you need to follow them through. Otherwise people will continue to disrespect those boundaries, and that's not okay. And that will have a really negative impact on your emotional well-being. So when someone crosses your boundary, what can you do? You can begin by sort of restating what that boundary is. And you know, where possible, you can do this in a positive way that doesn't need to sort of start an argument. So let's think of an example where maybe a family member comments on your weight or size, even though they know that this makes you uncomfortable. So you can start by restating what your boundary is to them. So saying something like, I know you don't mean to be hurtful, but I feel really uncomfortable when you make these comments about my weight, and I'd really appreciate it if you didn't make any in future. So there we go, so we've re-said, we've, you know, told them again what that boundary is. If they then continue to cross that boundary, they may respect that, and you know, that'll stop and that'll be enough, but they may continue to cross that boundary, and that might be when we feel like we have to put a consequence in place, a consequence to that action. So carrying on from the last example, they've continued to make comments about your weight. You can then say something like, you know, I've told you that these comments make me feel really uncomfortable. If this carries on, I'm going to have to leave the room. So there we go. Again, we've restated our boundary, and we've said what the consequence will be if they don't sort of respect that. And like I say, the important part of that is if that then does carry on, because I mean, by that point you've told them twice now that, you know, this isn't okay. You've told them what will happen if that carries on. So if it does carry on, then you really need to sort of go through with that and leave that room if that carries on. Because, you know, it's about teaching other people that they should respect you and your boundaries, but also teaching yourself that you are worthy of having those boundaries in place and worthy of being respected. And you know, that's how it all ties into our self-esteem. You know, teaching ourselves by looking after our well-being that, you know, we are worthy, and we are good enough and worthy of respect. So yeah, they're my top tips. So there we have it. We've spoken about boundaries, we've talked about how we can communicate those boundaries, how we can create those boundaries in the first place, and how, you know, what we can do if people continue to disrespect our boundaries. Hopefully you found that useful, even if it's just taught you that, you know, we all deserve to be treated with respect, because we do. Then, you know, if that's all we've learned from this video, then that is I'm okay with that. But yeah, I do hope that you've learned something and that you can take these tips and use them in your day-to-day interactions with people and your relationship with people, helping make them stronger and happier and healthier. So yeah, give us a like if you enjoyed it, if you found it useful. You're welcome to share this with friends. This might, you know, be a great hint to some people who are disrespecting your boundaries. You can send them this video in an assertive manner, obviously. Right, I'm waffling. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye.